stand at the base of a genuinely enormous object, a giant sequoia tree, a cathedral ceiling, the edge of a canyon that drops away farther than your eyes can easily process, and something specific and measurable happens inside your body before you have time to think about it. Your sense of the boundary between yourself and the world seems, for a moment, to loosen. Your ordinary preoccupations, the meeting you need to prepare for, the argument you had this morning, seem to recede, becoming suddenly and noticeably less important. Time itself seems to behave differently, often feeling as though it has slowed or expanded, and beneath all of this, there is a specific bodily sensation, frequently described as chills, a tightening in the chest, or the particular prickling sensation, sometimes called goosebumps, that reliably accompanies the experience. This is awe, and until relatively recently, it was one of the most neglected emotions in the scientific study of human psychology, largely overlooked in favor of the more commonly studied basic emotions like fear, anger, joy, and sadness. That neglect has ended dramatically over the past 2 decades, and the science that has emerged reveals awe to be one of the most psychologically consequential emotions available to human beings, one with measurable effects on everything from pro-social behavior to physical health to the basic neural architecture through which the brain represents the self. Let's begin with the foundational theoretical framework that first established awe as a serious object of scientific study. The psychologist Dacher Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley, working with Jonathan Haidt, published a landmark 2003 paper that proposed the first rigorous psychological definition of awe, identifying 2 core components that Keltner and Haidt argued are necessary and sufficient to produce the experience. Perceived vastness, encountering something that is immense in scale, whether physically, conceptually, or socially, that exceeds the observer's ordinary frame of reference, and the need for accommodation, the cognitive demand this vastness places on existing mental frameworks, which prove inadequate to fully process or categorize what is being encountered, and must be revised or expanded to make sense of it. This definition matters because it explains why awe can be triggered by such an enormously varied range of experiences, from natural landscapes to religious experience, to witnessing extraordinary human skill or moral courage, to encountering a genuinely novel scientific idea that reorganizes one's understanding of how the world works. What unites these apparently disparate triggers, on Keltner and Haidt's account, is not their specific content, but their shared structural property. Each presents the mind with something that exceeds its existing conceptual frameworks and that demands some degree of cognitive restructuring to accommodate. Keltner's subsequent research program, conducted over the following 2 decades, has documented in detail what awe actually does to the people who experience it, and the findings have consistently pointed toward a specific and theoretically coherent cluster of psychological effects centered on what Keltner and his collaborators call the small self, a measurable and temporary diminishment in the felt salience and importance of one's individual concerns, achievements, and identity relative to something larger than oneself. The psychologist Paul Piff, working closely with Keltner, conducted a series of influential experiments documenting the specific behavioral consequences of this small self effect, finding that experimentally induced awe, produced in controlled laboratory settings through methods including exposure to towering trees, dramatic nature videos, and vast panoramic imagery, reliably increases subsequent pro-social and ethical behavior, including increased generosity in economic games, increased willingness to volunteer time to help a stranger, and decreased reported feelings of entitlement. Piff's research proposes that this effect operates specifically through the small self mechanism, by temporarily diminishing the felt importance of one's individual concerns and interests. Awe creates psychological space for greater consideration of others and of the broader collective to which one belongs. Piff's most striking finding involved a controlled experiment in which participants stood among a grove of towering eucalyptus trees for a brief period before an ostensibly unrelated encounter with a Confederate who stumbled and dropped a handful of pens. Participants who had just experienced the awe-inducing tree exposure helped pick up significantly more pens than participants who had spent the same period looking at a nearby building of ordinary height, providing direct behavioral evidence that a brief awe experience can measurably increase spontaneous prosocial behavior toward a stranger encountered immediately afterward. The neuroscience of awe has been examined by the psychologist Michelle Shiota at Arizona State University, whose research has documented that awe experiences are associated with a specific pattern of physiological activation distinct from other positive emotions, including a distinctive combination of parasympathetic nervous system activation associated with calming and rest, alongside markers more typically associated with heightened arousal, a combination that helps explain awe's characteristically complex subjective quality, simultaneously calming and activating, rather than fitting cleanly into either the purely relaxing or purely exciting categories that characterize most other positive emotional states. Shiota's research has also documented that awe experiences are reliably associated with what researchers call self-diminishment on standardized measures of self-focus and self-relevant cognition. Participants who have just experienced awe show measurably reduced tendency to describe themselves using individualistic, self-focused language and increased tendency to describe themselves in terms of their membership in larger collectives and relationships, a finding that provides direct empirical support for Keltner's small self-theoretical framework using standardized psychological measurement rather than only behavioral outcomes. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention, because it addresses an important developmental and individual differences question. Whether the capacity to experience awe is a fixed trait present in similar measure across all people, or whether it varies systematically between individuals and across the human lifespan in ways that illuminate its underlying psychological function. The psychologist Craig Anderson at the University of California, Irvine, working within Keltner's broader research program, has documented that awe-proneness, the general disposition to experience awe with relative ease and frequency across a range of everyday situations, varies considerably between individuals and can be reliably measured using standardized psychological instruments. Anderson's research found that individuals higher in trait awe-proneness show correspondingly higher measures of overall life satisfaction, lower levels of chronic stress, and stronger reported feelings of social connectedness, even after statistically controlling for other personality factors known to influence these outcomes, suggesting that the capacity for awe is not merely a byproduct of already having a favorable disposition, but appears to make an independent contribution to psychological well-being. Anderson's research has also documented that awe-proneness can be meaningfully increased through deliberate intervention, finding that participants who engaged in a structured practice of actively seeking out and attending to awe-eliciting experiences in their daily lives over a period of several weeks, a practice Anderson and his colleagues term an awe walk, showed measurable increases in daily positive emotion and decreases in daily distress compared to control participants who engaged in comparably structured walks without a specific instruction to seek out awe, providing evidence that the capacity to experience awe, while showing stable individual differences, is also responsive to deliberate cultivation rather than being an entirely fixed trait. The developmental question of how the capacity for awe changes across the human lifespan has been examined by the psychologist Melanie Shiota, in research conducted separately from her work on awe's physiological signature, documenting that older adults, somewhat counterintuitively given the common cultural assumption that wonder and awe are primarily associated with childhood, report awe experiences with comparable or even somewhat greater frequency than younger adults, though the specific triggers that reliably elicit awe appear to shift across the lifespan, with older adults showing a relatively greater tendency to report awe in response to social and relational triggers, including witnessing acts of exceptional human kindness or moral courage, compared to younger adults who show a relatively greater tendency to report awe triggered by nature and aesthetic experience specifically. This developmental pattern connects to a broader theoretical account proposed by the psychologist Laura Carstensen at Stanford University, whose influential socioemotional selectivity theory documents that, as people age and become more acutely aware of the finite nature of remaining time, their emotional and attentional priorities shift systematically toward experiences that are meaningful and emotionally significant in the present moment, rather than experiences oriented toward long-term future goals. Awe researchers, including Shiota, have proposed that the shifting pattern of awe triggers across the lifespan, from primarily aesthetic and nature-based triggers in younger adulthood toward primarily social and moral triggers in later life. may reflect this broader developmental shift in what kinds of experience feel most meaningful and significant as the subjective sense of remaining lifespan narrows, connecting the study of awe to a broader and independently well-established body of research on how human emotional priorities evolve across the full course of a human life. The relationship between awe and the brain's default mode network, the interconnected set of brain regions that show characteristic activation during self-referential thought, mind-wandering, and the construction of autobiographical narrative, has been examined by the neuroscientist Yang Bai and colleagues, whose brain imaging research found that intense awe experiences are associated with measurably reduced activation in regions of the default mode network, specifically associated with self-referential processing. This finding provides a specific neurobiological mechanism, potentially underlying the subjective experience of self-diminishment that awe reliably produces. The brain regions most centrally involved in constructing and maintaining an ongoing sense of individual self appear to become measurably less active during intense awe experiences, consistent with the subjective reports of ego dissolution and diminished self-focus that awe researchers have documented using behavioral and self-report methods. The psychologist Jennifer Steller at the University of Toronto has extended the study of awe into the domain of physical health, documenting a specific and clinically significant finding. Awe, more than any other positive emotion examined in her research program, is associated with reduced levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, specific immune system signaling molecules whose chronic elevation is associated with a wide range of negative health outcomes including cardiovascular disease, depression, and accelerated aging. Steller's research found that the experience of awe specifically, distinguished from other positive emotions including amusement, contentment, and pride, showed the strongest association with lower levels of these inflammatory markers, suggesting that awe may carry unique physiological benefits not shared equally by positive emotion in general. Steller has proposed that this finding connects to the broader evolutionary account of awe's function, drawing on research suggesting that awe evolved specifically as an emotion that facilitates social bonding and group cohesion, given the evolutionary importance of strong social bonds and group membership for human survival throughout evolutionary history. An emotion that reliably produces the specific psychological state of feeling smaller and more connected to something larger than oneself would have conferred a survival advantage by strengthening the cooperative bonds within social groups on which ancestral human survival critically depended. And the reduction in inflammatory markers may reflect a broader physiological signature of the reduced psychological stress associated with feeling securely embedded within a supportive social collective, a state that awe reliably and rapidly induces. The specific relationship between awe and the perception of time has been documented by the psychologist Melanie Rudd, whose research found that awe experiences reliably produce the subjective sense that time has expanded or slowed, and that this altered time perception is not simply an incidental accompaniment to the awe experience, but appears to be functionally connected to some of awe's other documented psychological benefits. Rudd's research found that participants who experienced awe subsequently reported feeling like they had more available time, showed increased willingness to volunteer their time to help others, and expressed greater overall life satisfaction, with statistical analysis indicating that the expanded subjective sense of available time substantially explained the relationship between awe exposure and these downstream positive outcomes. Rudd's proposed explanation for this connection draws on the broader psychological literature on the relationship between time pressure and prosocial behavior. People who feel chronically pressed for time show measurably reduced willingness to help others and reduced overall well-being, and awe's capacity to interrupt this sense of time pressure, even temporarily, by pulling attention fully into a present moment, vast and significant enough to override the ordinary mental processes that generate a persistent sense of time scarcity, may represent one of the specific mechanisms through which awe produces its documented benefits for prosocial behavior and subjective well-being. The question of whether different categories of awe-eliciting experience produce meaningfully different psychological effects has been examined by the psychologist Alan Cohen and colleagues, whose comparative research distinguishing between what they term positive awe, characterized by predominantly pleasant emotional content, such as encountering vast natural beauty, and what they term threat-based awe, characterized by an admixture of fear or vulnerability, such as encountering an overwhelming natural disaster or a genuinely dangerous vast landscape, found that while both categories reliably produce the core small self and cognitive accommodation effects central to Keltner and Haidt's original theoretical framework, threat-based awe experiences are considerably more likely to produce negative subsequent emotional states and are less reliably associated with the pro-social and well-being benefits documented for predominantly positive awe experiences, suggesting that the specific emotional valence accompanying an awe-eliciting encounter substantially shapes its downstream psychological consequences even when the core structural features of vastness and cognitive accommodation are present in both cases. There is one further body of research worth examining because it addresses the practical question of how the well-documented benefits of awe are being deliberately applied in clinical and applied psychological contexts, moving the science of awe from pure theoretical interest toward practical intervention. The psychologist Virginia Sturm at the University of California, San Francisco, has conducted research specifically examining awe interventions in clinical populations, documenting that a structured practice of regular awe-seeking, implemented among combat veterans experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, produced measurable reductions in self-reported stress and improvements in psychological well-being over a study period, with participants who engaged in whitewater rafting expeditions specifically designed to produce sustained awe exposure through encounters with dramatic natural landscapes showing significantly greater improvement than a comparison group. Sturm's research proposes that awe's capacity to interrupt self-focused rumination, a cognitive pattern strongly associated with the maintenance of post-traumatic stress symptoms, may provide a specific therapeutic mechanism through which structured awe exposure produces clinical benefit, connecting the basic laboratory research on awe's self-diminishment effect directly to a specific and clinically meaningful applied outcome. The psychologist Amie Gordon at the University of California, San Francisco, has examined how awe experiences function within the context of romantic relationships specifically, finding that couples who share awe-inducing experiences together, whether through shared exposure to dramatic natural environments or through witnessing significant creative or artistic experiences jointly, report measurably increased relationship satisfaction and stronger feelings of connectedness with their partner following the shared experience, compared to couples who spend equivalent time together in emotionally neutral activities. Gordon's research suggests that awe's small self and social connection effects, documented at the level of general pro-social behavior toward strangers in Piff's original research, extend specifically and measurably into the maintenance and strengthening of established close relationships, providing a further practical application of awe research with direct relevance to ordinary relationship maintenance rather than only to encounters with strangers or clinical populations. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Alison Gopnik, whose research on childhood exploration we examined in an earlier video in this series on why humans have childhood, has drawn an explicit theoretical connection between awe and the broader psychological literature on exploration versus exploitation, proposing that awe may function specifically as a signal that reorients cognitive resources toward exploratory processing, temporarily suspending the efficient, exploitative use of existing mental models in favor of the kind of open, flexible cognitive engagement required to genuinely accommodate a vast and unfamiliar stimulus. This theoretical connection helps explain why awe experiences are so often described by those who experience them as producing a specific quality of heightened attentiveness and curiosity, a mind temporarily freed from its habitual patterns of interpretation and made unusually receptive to genuinely new information, a state with significant potential relevance to creativity, learning, and the kind of cognitive flexibility that Gopnik's broader research program has identified as a hallmark of the exploratory psychological mode. These applied extensions of the basic science of awe illustrate a broader pattern that has characterized the field's rapid development over the past 2 decades. What began as a largely theoretical effort to establish awe as a legitimate and definable object of psychological study has increasingly generated findings with direct and measurable practical significance, spanning clinical intervention for trauma, the maintenance of romantic relationships, and the broader project of understanding what specific conditions reliably promote human prosocial behavior and psychological well-being. What emerges from this substantial and rapidly developing body of research is a picture of awe as a distinctive and evolutionarily significant emotional system, one specifically calibrated to respond to genuine vastness by temporarily reorganizing the brain's normal self-focused processing in ways that measurably increase social connection, prosocial behavior, and physiological markers of reduced stress, functioning as a specific psychological mechanism through which encounters with things larger than the individual self translate directly into strengthened bonds with the social and natural world that individual self is embedded within. The sensation you feel standing beneath a genuinely enormous tree, or looking out across a landscape that exceeds what your visual system can comfortably process in a single glance, is not simply aesthetic pleasure. It is a specific and ancient neural response, one that briefly quiets the machinery your brain uses to maintain its ordinary, continuous sense of individual importance, and that does so specifically because a mind capable of occasionally setting aside its own significance, however briefly, in the face of something genuinely larger than itself, turns out to be a mind considerably better equipped for the fundamentally social and cooperative task of surviving as a member of a group. Awe is not a luxury feeling, reserved for vacations and cathedral ceilings. It is one of the oldest tools your mind has for remembering, however briefly, that you were never quite as separate from everything else as your ordinary, self-focused consciousness tends to assume. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.